Right, good afternoon everyone. My name's Sarah Geekie and I'm the Quality Improvement Officer here at the Preschool Learning Alliance. And it's my pleasure today to welcome you to today's webinar, Risky Play in the Early Years, Getting the Balance Right. So, the leader of today's session is Melanie Pilcher, and she's the Quality and Standards Manager here at the Preschool Learning Alliance. My role today is here to act as chair and take any questions from members of the audience. Mel is leading on the session and will direct conversations, and I will try and feed any questions you have throughout today's webinar. For those of you who are most frequent webinar attendees, you will know that these webinars are recorded and we will make them available on the Preschool Learning Alliance's YouTube site. Either later this week or early next week, you'll be able to see them. Before I hand you over to Mel, I'll give you a brief introduction of the structure of the session. For those of you who attended before, you will be familiar with the webinars. If it's new to you, it's similar to a seminar, but instead of being in a classroom, you're listening over the web. So we're going to do about a 15 to 20 minute session. Let me just get that slide for you. That's right, so we're going to do a 15 to minute 20 session and then a 25 to 30 minutes question. Sometimes when the questions come up throughout the session, so we will just drop those in as and when. Don't worry about any spelling or punctuations if you want to send us a question. We won't be looking at that, we're just looking at the content of your question. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Mel so she can begin her presentation.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And as we move on to the next slide, you'll see we're just quickly flashing up your control panel there for you. And you can see that you type questions, any questions that you want into the box, and we will answer them as we go along. So thank you for that, Sarah. So moving on to our first slide then, if I show this picture to you, I'm just wondering what is your first thought? Is it ever acceptable for a 3-year-old child to be playing with a knife? Especially at a time when we're hearing reports in the media, it seems every day, of teenagers who are actually stabbing each other to death. Sarah, what's your immediate reaction to that picture?
Well, my first one is, how sharp is that knife?
Yeah.
It's so close to his hands. And then I was thinking, okay, he's alone. Where are the adults? Where is the adult? I mean, he's outside. Who knows? He looks like he could run into the car park at any point, completely unsupervised. And then I also thought, is this his first time using a knife? Because the way he's holding it maybe suggests could be, could not be. And then I was thinking risk assessment.
We love our risk assessments, don't we, Sarah?
We certainly do.
Thank you for that. And I'm not going to actually say too much about this particular slide at the moment because I want to revisit it at the end of this presentation and we'll just look at it in a more positive view. But that was a wonderfully negative view of the picture that we had there. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, if we just move on then. So why are we all so hung up on risk in the first place? And the reason I wanted to spend some time thinking about that is because before we can address risky play, we really need to address risk and our perception of risk, which is why I started off with the picture of a child playing with a penknife. Our priority, in fact, should be to identify real and actual hazards. What we want to do in this session is highlight the fact that risk, in particular risky play, is in fact hugely important for children, and that risk management has stifled children's opportunities for risky play. The terms risk and risk management is often used in the wrong context in the first place, and often for the wrong reasons. So much so that even the Health and Safety Executive have found the need to issue a statement that tries to clarify things, stating that risk management is not about scaring people by exaggerating or publicising trivial risks. Risk management is not about stopping important recreational and learning activities for individuals where the risks are managed. Risk management is not about creating a totally risk-free society, and it's certainly not about generating useless paperwork mountains, which is something in early years which we are all very conscious of anyway. So if you believe some of the stories that you hear, health and safety is all about stopping any activity that might possibly lead to harm. This is not our vision of sensible health and safety. We want to save lives, not stop them. And that's what the Health and Safety Executive have said. And the point is that we're trying to reinforce here that very often the opportunities for children to take part in risky play are completely removed in the name of health and safety, often wrongly so. And what happens is when we only focus on risk, then sometimes we forget what the real hazard is. And there is a difference. A hazard, as defined by the Health and Safety Executive, is anything that may cause harm, such as chemicals, electricity, working from ladders, an open drawer. All of these things could be a hazard in the right circumstances. The risk is the chance, whether that be high, medium or low, that somebody could be harmed by these and other hazards, together with an indication of how serious that harm could be. And that is what we understand the structure of a standard risk assessment to be. But when we do focus on that risk, we do, as I said before, forget to identify what the real hazard is. And a good example of this, as we both know, is conkers.
Oh, the game I used to love playing.
We all love conkers, but don't they hurt? Yes.
Yes, that's true.
So we've all seen the headlines, health and safety gone mad.
Children wearing goggles.
Yes, yes, and protective gloves. Conkers banned from playgrounds. But what actually are the real hazards? Because I don't know about you, Sarah, but I've never actually heard of a child being seriously injured by playing conkers.
I haven't heard yet, but I'm sure there's going to be one story out there.
I'm sure there will be. Wrapped knuckles, yes.
That's true.
The occasional bruise, yes. But what the Health and Safety Executive site reports are accident reports that tell us of a child injured from falling from a tree when collecting conkers.
Oh yes, of course.
A child being injured by a stick being thrown to try and remove those conkers. You know, the tricky ones? Yes. There's always the big one on the tree.
The best ones are higher up.
Always. And one child injured by a branch falling on their head. And yes, and of course these are all serious, but the actual hazard was not the conker. Even so, that myth quickly came about that Health and Safety Executive had banned conkers. Not true. Anyone who's ever played conkers knows that those wrapped knuckles hurt like mad, but isn't that part of the thrill of the game? The challenge of not getting hurt and the skill of avoiding your opponent's attack? Maybe, Sarah, there's still some conkers around. Maybe we should bring some into the office tomorrow and give it a go. So let's try and give this a little bit more context now. We are hung up on risk because we have a responsibility to children, and children are vulnerable. They're unable to judge risks because they haven't yet developed the cognitive ability required to apply their past experience and knowledge to a situation and to make an informed judgment about what might happen. And they do this through play, risky play. Children have accidents because they're not able to judge risk. They learn this through play. Practitioners and carers have a personal accountability to protect themselves and children and to keep children safe from harm. And this sometimes requires us making decisions on behalf of children. And in some situations, yes, stopping them from doing something when they're playing because we believe the risk of harm is too great. And we've just talked about health and safety law, and we know there are a wealth of health and safety laws that we have already mentioned, but quite often they're misused or at least misinterpreted in the name of keeping children safe. We have to adhere to parental expectations. A child is a treasured possession, and trusting your child to the care of another person is a big ask. Parents have every right to expect that when their child is being cared for by us, they are at the very least safe from harm. Parental expectations are also greatly influenced by their own experiences as children, which is a factor that influences their choice of childcare in the first place. For example, choosing the nursery that has a great outdoor ethos, perhaps has direct access to a beach or a wood, or a nursery that places an emphasis on children being able to use tools as opposed to a nursery that is sited in a fenced compound and is equipped with a wealth of toddler-sized plastic representations of real life. And anybody that's heard my webinars before will know my opinions about plastic representations. It's not very exciting, but it's perfectly safe. There's also a perception that's similar to that of health and safety that's often cited as a reason for not doing something. Ofsted wouldn't like it. I recently attended a big conversation event in Birmingham, which was hosted by Ofsted, where an Ofsted inspector gave a presentation on risk that completely blew that idea out of the water, and is actually what inspired me to put this webinar together, because in a room of perhaps 200 practitioners, I was listening to the comments that were being made, and it was actually a revelation to a lot of people that, you know what, it's not Ofsted stopping us from doing this. We need to find ways to ensure that children get access to the risky play that they so desperately need as part of their normal development. The media is another thing that makes us very hung up on risk. The most horrific news story any parent or carer can read is any that involves a child coming to harm. These stories shock us and they galvanise us into action to make sure it never happens again. Bouncy castles, fairgrounds, school trips, to name but a few examples. And of course, we live in a digital world now where these stories are instantly shared, analysed and added to in a way that would not have been possible decades ago. And so my final question to you then is, are children really more at risk now than ever before? Just take a moment to look at the picture. These children are playing on a bomb site where no doubt there would have been unexploded bombs. They would also have played in the streets. They will have roamed for miles and they were under constant threat from childhood illnesses and disease, apart from the actual war taking place. My own children rode in a car with no seat belts in the back and no car seats. They rode their bikes with no helmets, and they visited grandparents who smoked. Terrible mother. But at the time, all of these things were deemed to be acceptable. We didn't know any different. And if I asked you to name a favourite childhood play memory that has stayed with you, it would no doubt involve an element of risk. Did you want to share that, Sarah?
Well, yeah, I was just thinking of my own experiences growing up as a child, and I used to play in the woods, completely unsupervised, and it was probably about a 15-minute walk away from my home, and in streams and rivers, and, you know, we just used to climb over the fence and play in the river, and it was deep. So, yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Mel. You just think about our own experiences.
Yes.
How we've changed.
But you obviously managed that pretty well, Sarah, because you are with us here today. And my question, as I said before, does anybody know of a child who was actually seriously injured by a conker? No. So are children really more at risk when they play now than ever before? I would argue that the immediate risks to children are in fact fewer, whereas the long-term risks to our children are those that we seem to find harder to tackle. Obesity, mental health and well-being, online safety, to name but a few. So the level of risk to young children is probably the same, but the hazards are very different, and maybe it could be argued that our focus and our priorities have become skewed over time. So why are we so unwilling to let children take risks in their play? As I said before, it's our role to keep children safe. There's no arguing with that. But it's also our role to help children to keep themselves safe. And we do that by taking risks in our play. We believe that we've got to identify every hazard on behalf of the children and remove it. And in any situation that involves risk, the child is the last line of defence. They have to learn to manage risk. And this is what risky play enables them to do in a manner and at a pace that suits them. For example, we've all seen the child in the outdoor area who stands back and watches an older, more confident child climb the ladder to the big slide, and they might watch that for weeks before they attempt to do so themselves. And this is a really good example of a child identifying a new challenge assessing the likelihood of harm, but also taking into consideration the important risk-benefit. And we're going to look at that later in some more detail. And that is the delight and thrill of sliding at speed down the other side of that ladder, and that sense of achievement from that child who reaches the bottom, and you will see them look around as if, did everybody see me do that? I did it. I managed it. It was okay. And then they do it over and over again. So it's certainly the case that family leisure time, as you look at the third bullet point, is more precious and is more likely to be structured with a visit to a site, a theme park, a play barn, or some other venue where all hazards have been removed and children are directed in how they use equipment to avoid any chance of harm occurring. And that leads us on to the fact that there are fewer real opportunities for children to really test themselves, but more importantly, to decide what risks to take and how to approach them. And of course, there's no getting away from the issue of litigation. It's big business, but it does little to improve safety. It is just likely to make us all more risk averse, which is really sad. And another picture for you. It really does speak for itself, doesn't it? But our perception of risk influences, like Sarah likes the idea of this. I do think they've been photoshopped, Sarah.
Okay.
Our perception of risk is skewed greatly by who we are, the level of control we have over the situation, and of course our level of understanding. So the father in the first picture, he's in control, he knows his own limits, and he throws his child high enough to know that he can safely catch that child again. As the child sees it, the child's flying through the air. They have little perception of the consequences of what happens if they get dropped, it's going to hurt. And they're thrilled by that action, knowing that daddy will catch them. And then as the mother sees it, the mother feels somewhat helpless. She's got no control over the situation other than to try to stop the game and issue a common sense warning. Be careful, not too high, don't drop him. So when it comes to risky play, we all have our perceptions and we all have our own sense of responsibility. So let's move on now.
Oh, sorry, before we do, Mel, I've got a question from Annie from Newcastle.
Okay.
She says, we have some parents who are overprotective with their child or children. How can we help them to understand the importance of risky play?
Yeah, I think this is a wonderful opportunity to share with parents exactly what risky play is and to get past that idea. We were talking earlier, weren't we, Sarah, about the fact that the word risk is quite unfortunate, really, because it immediately makes you think health and safety and danger.
Risk assessment.
And risk assessment and paperwork, where actually risky play, and we're going to look at it in the next few slides, is not that at all. And we need to be able to share that with parents to show them what it is actually that we're trying to achieve and what it is developmentally that their child needs, and put it in a way that parents can sort of buy into. So let's go through the next few slides, because I really do think that they will give you some idea, Annie, of how you can actually approach this and have those conversations with parents. So play is a process, not a product, as in it's not something that we produce on behalf of children or structure so that we come up with a product that we can define as play. Play is dynamic. It constantly surprises and delights children as they test boundaries and revel in its endless possibilities. Play allows children to test their physical skills, to rehearse ideas, and to set their own challenges. Play belongs to children, helping them to dare to learn, to take risks, and to make sense of the world around them. And if you want to know which clever person actually put that quote together, it was me. But that's something I think that we need to keep in mind, that actually as soon as we start to try and manipulate and set a criteria for children's play, we are often removing those essential elements, and in this case the essential element being risk, and we will come on to that in some more detail. So when we look at play in this way, we see that it is not something we should structure for children. Play belongs to children and it's on their terms. One of the many risks a baby first takes is driven by their innate need to play as they roll across the floor to reach something that's caught their attention, as they take their first steps towards a toy, despite falling down time and time again, probably with a bump and tears. It's as they move away from their trusted adult, their secure base for the first time, because they need to play, and the need to play and explore is so strong within them. And that's a really big risk for a child to take. Risky play, the first example we see of it, stepping away from your secure base. Thank you, Sarah. And why is that so important? Well, we've just started really to touch on that, but children need risk. We've established that it's important, and we're starting to look now at why. It's an important component of play. We've identified that it's not always the risk that needs removing from a situation, but the correct hazards must be identified in the first place, and that's the health and safety part of it. I haven't got any problem with that. If children's environments do not offer sufficient risk and challenge, they will seek it out elsewhere. And some academics would argue that many of the current issues with gang culture and knife crime are simply because young children are seeking risk and challenge that they have not been able to experience. And of course, that is putting it very succinctly, because it's a much bigger issue and a much wider issue than that. Risk and challenge promote resilience. Yes, because trial and error, failure and success all contribute towards resilience, helping to ensure that children keep on trying and are willing to have a go. In other words, risky play and the characteristics of effective learning, they go hand in hand. And the final point there, risk is a muscle that children need to flex. And I just love that. It's as important to their development as physical activity. Risk is a muscle that children need to flex. And what happens to our muscles if we don't use them? They grow weak and ineffectual.
Right, just on that note, I've got a question from Giles in Devon. He's saying, at what age should we introduce more risky play and more challenging experiences?
Oh, wow.
You touched about a baby, so it sounds like they're already doing it.
Yeah, and that's the whole point, really, that when we start to feel as if we've got to introduce risk to children's play, then we are doing exactly what I've said there. We are taking over their play, and we're trying to create play as a product when it isn't. It's a process. So really, this is about tuning into to children's age and stage of development and making sure that those opportunities are there for children to express those characteristics of effective learning. And to take those risks at a time and a pace that suits them, so that, you know, babies in the baby room have the opportunity to pull themselves up, that toys are out of reach to actually, you know, encourage them to move towards them, and so on. So, no, this is about following and tuning into children's levels of development and making sure that we facilitate rather than provide.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Mel.
Thank you.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes.
This is what I've been thinking of all afternoon.
Exactly, and I think that just shows, you know, from the questions we've had as well, what is risky play? Is this about children learning to wire a plug and you know, use electricity safely? So I wanted to try and move past the idea that risky play is dangerous. So let's just move on and see what we've got. I like that picture. Play requires an element of risk. We've made that point, and now we're going to look a little bit more at why. Children need to be able to make risky decisions in their play, and this is about their independent thinking and self-reflection. So, for example, the child on the log that you can see in the corner of your screen, should I jump from this log to the ground? Once she's made that decision to jump, she then must evaluate the decision. She takes time to reflect on the outcome of the action taken, and that's really important. Did the jump down lead to success, or was it perhaps not the best plan to take? Thinking about what to do differently next time leads to strategic, thoughtful risk-taking in the future. Each time she goes through this process, she's strengthening her independent thinking skills. And then we talk about children taking risky actions in their play, and by taking risks, children start to develop age-appropriate strength, coordination and good body awareness. But if we consistently prevent children from taking risks, we start to see some delays in their sensory and motor development. That may not have been an issue if they'd been given daily exposure to these experiences. This leads to poor spatial awareness, and without an exposure to risk-taking, children can in fact become more accident-prone and unsafe in the long run. And if anybody's heard previous webinars, you may have heard me mention before that one of the most common injuries that presents in A&E is broken collarbones from children who do not know how to fall over.
Whoa.
Yes.
That's interesting. And are most accidents in the home, Mel? Or do you have any things about that?
There are figures. I'm
Okay.
glad you asked me that, because there are figures actually about the number of accidents that happen in the home, and it's still the case that accidents to children are generally more prevalent in the home.
Right. Okay.
So moving on, children talking about risky interactions with others during their play, which is part of children's development of social skills. A lot of risk-taking is done independently, but children often take risks while interacting with others. Reasonable risk-taking allows them to develop confidence among their peers. The risk itself might be to share an idea with friends or to go and join the group of friends at the art table. Reasonable risk-taking allows children to develop assertiveness and self-confidence that helps them to participate positively in social settings. Practice and more practice helps them to learn to balance their assertiveness with respect and compassion for others. And while voicing an opinion or thought is important, over time children recognise that their peers may have other ideas to consider. And children need to recognise risky behaviour in others, and that again is about cultivation of confidence. Reasonable risk-taking in play results in a willingness to make mistakes and to learn from failure. For instance, a child grazes his or her knee climbing a rock, but in the process learns that he can still reach the top. This assurance that a child can overcome obstacles translates to other risky life decisions presented in childhood, and it's important that children learn the excitement of the success, the coping skills needed to handle failure, and the perseverance to try and try again, even if it's uncomfortable and hard. So what is the adult's role then? What is the practitioner's role? I can sum it up really in these 4 bullet points. To be able to enable children to take acceptable risk. By all means, identify and remove hazards when children are playing, but actually leave some level of risk there as well. Knowing when to step back and when to step in. And it's really hard, isn't it, when you see a child struggling to do something, and you will see it if you stand back and observe the practitioner who says, oh, let me help you, let me take your hand, let me lower that plank from those two pieces of wood to make it lower for you, let me help you. We need sometimes to stand back and let children actually get it wrong.
You're helping them, I would have thought, by observing them in their play and then talking them through it.
Yes.
I used to do that as a teacher, you know, when it was too high, we'd find, well, what can you do? What would be your next step? How can you achieve that? So yeah, you're right, Mel, it's just not about changing everything, it's helping them in other ways.
Yes, I once visited a nursery where they had the biggest and most complex climbing frame I'd ever seen, and it was really high. And I asked the nursery owner, have you ever had children stuck up there? Because it doesn't look to me like an adult could actually get up there to rescue a child. Wow. And she said, well, in fairness, yes, we've had a few children get stuck, but we've always managed to talk them down. So there you go. And again, our role is to facilitate opportunities for children to make judgments for themselves. Stand back. And you said quite rightly, Sarah, about, you know, talking children through, but actually just waiting and giving them time first because as carers, as practitioners, sometimes we do jump in a little bit too quickly, don't we?
I think we're all guilty of that.
I think
yes.
we've all done it. Observe the learning that's happening and look for the risk benefit. I've mentioned that twice now, and in a couple of slides you'll see what I mean. And provide that challenge and let children make mistakes. So we're not providing risky play, but we do provide challenge within play opportunities. So I talked about risk benefit once or twice, and this is something I've seen cropping up quite a lot lately. Myself, I've just qualified as a forest school leader for my own personal satisfaction, and I took along a copy of a risk assessment that we use, and the tutor said to me, right, you need to add another column in there, and I said, but it's got everything it needs in there, and you know, I know about health and safety, so I know. She said, no, you're missing the most important column that we have in risk assessment in forest school, which is the column that says risk benefit.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Different way to look at things. So, of course, with our risk assessments, we identify the hazard, and I put in brackets the real hazard, not the conker, when it's actually the tree, the sticks, the branch, the child climbing that's the hazard. Identify the level of risk. We know we're very good at doing this, whether it be low, medium or high. And, of course, the measures required to reduce, remove or minimise the risk. Standard risk assessment practice, we all know it, we do it all the time. So let's think about putting that risk-benefit column in there, and we start to think about, well, what are the learning opportunities if we let this activity go ahead? And obviously, if there's a high risk and an extreme hazard, we can't do this. But when we're looking at low and medium risk, think about the learning opportunities. Think about the health and well-being of that child, from being able to actually achieve something, take that risk, to master that skill. And that's what I've put at the bottom, the opportunity for children to gain mastery over the things that they're on the cusp of actually being able to do. And I would suggest to anybody that the next time you do an activity with children, or you've got a planned activity and you want to actually do a risk assessment, just add in that risk benefit and just see if it changes your perception of what you're actually doing. It may make you think more about actually the activity itself and whether it provides enough opportunity for children to actually take those risks during their play.
Right, I've just had a question from Saheed about risk benefit.
Okay.
He's saying, what if there is no risk benefit?
Well, yes, sometimes there won't be. And, you know, like I said, if the hazard is real and is there, and the risk of the child getting harmed is high, then there probably won't be a risk benefit, fair enough. But if the hazard is low and medium, then I can guarantee you, Zahid, that you will find some benefit. And if you don't, share it, talk to your colleagues about it and see what their perception is. As I mentioned before, everybody has a different perception of risk, and it comes down to our own experiences, our own background. So I think that's a really important point. It's a really good point made, but I would challenge you, Zahid, and say, I bet you, if you're looking at it properly, there will be a benefit. And as we come to the end of this webinar, I ask you again to look at this picture, and I ask you again, acceptable? Well, as I mentioned, I've just become a forest school leader. I won't say it again, I promise. And one of the things that I worried about was myself using a knife.
Oh, okay.
Let alone using a knife with a 3-year-old child. And when I learned about how that's approached in forest schools, certainly, that we talk about the fact, you know, the first thing we think of is, oh, a safety knife, a blunt knife, you know, so a knife with no edge on it that can't really do any damage. But actually, the first thing we learn is that a blunt knife or blunt tools are more dangerous. We also learn about something called a blood bubble, which, again, sounds really horrifying.
Tell us about that.
This is actually about, and I wish I could demonstrate it, but I can't, but this is about getting the child to stretch their arms up above their head and stretch out to the side as far as they can to make sure that nobody's within arm's reach of them. So if they swing round with the knife, the person sitting next to them will be out of their way. And you can actually hear the children in forest school sessions actually sitting down, and they know they're going to get the tools out, and they will actually all do their blood bubble, and they will shuffle around until they are within their own space and they know that they're safe. And of course, you know, we learn how to hold and handle a tool correctly. And if we don't get to do this in a supervised way, what we find is children who are picking up a knife for the first time, maybe because they found it, maybe because they're playing with other children who have had the opportunity to do this in a childcare setting, and they just don't know. They haven't got a clue how to do it. And there's a safe way to do it. And the wonderful thing about forest school particularly is listening to those young children explaining to other people, to visitors, how to do it properly and how to do it safely. And I was told very clearly when I attended my first forest school session by a very young child, barely three-year-old, that I must sit down, I must find my blood bubble, I must not walk around with my knife, and when I have finished, I must give it back.
Simple, clear instructions.
Yes. So that actually fills me with joy, not trepidation, because I think, well, there's a child actually learning to master a skill. And it's not just knives, it comes down to anything. I've seen children actually hurt themselves with potato peelers when they've been whittling, because again, they just have no idea and they assume it's safe and they have no idea how to use it.
So Mel, I'm now looking at this picture and thinking of the risk benefit. Just from listening to this presentation this afternoon, I'm already thinking, yeah, more children should have this opportunity.
Definitely. I'm really glad you said that. Thank you, Sarah.
Right.
And as we end today's presentation, I suppose the call to all of you, the challenge to all of you, is to take some risks yourself in what you're doing and what you're providing, but also to identify that risky play is not about health and safety. Risky play is a normal part and an important part of play and a child's development. So the challenge to all of us is to actually make sure that what we're doing, what we're providing, is not actually taking away children's right to play. If you've enjoyed the session and would like to actually expand on it further, we do have a similar Smart PD pack that you might want to actually access. All of our presentations eventually get turned into these packs. This one won't be for a time yet, but the one that I've also have, which is linked to risk and risk management, is called Not on My Watch, and this is very much about health and safety and risk assessment. It's a PowerPoint presentation with facilitator notes that you can use in a staff meeting. So it's an electronic resource. It's £14 to you if you're a member, or £20 to you if you're a non-member. But if you quote risky when you order it, you will receive an additional 20% until the end of December 2018. So with that little bit of sales pitch at the end of my presentation, I'm going to hand you back over to Sarah and say thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. And Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Mel. That was really good. Picked up some key things, the difference between hazards and risks. So I'll be looking at that and thinking about that a bit more. And, you know, looking and thinking about more child-initiated learning. So that will really move on with the risk element to children's play. Before we say goodbye, I just want to say thank you so much, and for all the attendees who joined us today. And this webinar will be available on the YouTube channel early next week. Thank you.